As you may have guessed by now, Abundance isn't particularly interested in fairness or accessibility. It even says as much. Quote, "It is tempting to say that with these essentials already in existence, it is time for society to focus only on the fair distribution of existing resources rather than the creation of new ideas. But this would be worse than a failure of imagination. It would be a kind of generational theft," unquote. This is clearly a false dichotomy. You don't need to abandon the innovations of new things to extend availability of already existing things. Why would we only aim at fair distribution and stop inventing things? This statement is absurd, but obviously one thing is clear. The authors believe two things can't be done with government money. It can only be invested or redistributed, and they'd prefer it be invested. I thought it would be appropriate to name this section after Gil Scott-Heron's poem Whitey on the Moon, a poem written about a black family struggling to afford basic things while their tax dollars fund the first moon landing mission. The average American doesn't really seem to care about innovations when they don't have a good standard of living now. The authors argue that technologies will follow, like cell phones and computers, and they do benefit our lives, but they also become another necessity to function in the modern working world, another barrier to entry. Innovations are great, but our hierarchy of needs demands we focus on the practical things that are currently achievable, only to then imagine something better. I can't imagine telling someone like Gil Scott-Heron, quote, "No private companies were close to putting a man on the moon in 1960s, so NASA did it. Government should have a vision of the future, and within that vision, it can create space for companies to do what otherwise cannot, to make possible what is otherwise impossible," unquote. It's a funny thing to advocate for enabling companies to do impossible things with government money, while we're not really using government money to allow people to do possible things. This is the part where I make a full accusation. I don't think the authors care about fair distribution. I think this book is about prioritizing innovation over everything, even if it means those innovations only benefit the wealthy. This leads to a big question I had while reading. Is this book honest? They do spell out early on they're not really interested in fair distribution as they are in removing bottlenecks that impede innovation. However, they do use the language of progressives advocating for better outcomes, but primarily better outcomes for innovation that will theoretically benefit everyone. However, they oddly omit generative AI, and unless I missed it somewhere, they never admit it'll take people's jobs. I think a big aim here is pushing back against perceived Luddites and the degrowth movement, but the Luddites weren't bad. They were just looking out for their own economic interests. We all are. When living in a competitive society where everyone is out for themselves, we advocate for our individual interests, even to the detriment of others. It's capitalism. Of course, Luddite behavior isn't exclusive to the working class, as I've said before, whether the upper class or working class. If a new innovation threatens their well-being, it's going to have opposition. But what really bugs me is the capitalist critique. Rare it may be, they indicate how construction, government funding, science and technology are all impeded by capitalism. Though they don't bring it up much, they do bring it up. So we know, for a fact, they're aware of the water they're swimming in. But for the vast majority of the book, they act like it's not really a problem, which leads me to conclude what this book is and who it's for.
Forward, backward, inward, outward, come and join the chase. Nothing could be drier than a jolly caucus race. Backward, forward, outward, inward, bottom to the top. Never a beginning, there can never be a stop.
This book is about coupling government resources with private business. It's a book expressing the most optimistic outlook on corporate socialism. One of the funniest inconsistencies in the book centers around work culture. The book hypes the need for new technologies to improve our lives, but quickly backs off this point when it comes to remote work. When remarking on the importance of cities and how they attract tech professionals, they say it's best to have face-to-face work instead of using communications technology to work remotely. Quote, To defeat the human need for face-to-face contact, our technological marvels would need to defeat millions of years of human evolution that has made us into machines for learning from the people next to us, Glacier writes. This resolves the paradox of the metropolis. We vanquish distance from shipping and sails, but innovation thrives amid closeness, which is to say it thrives in cities, and because it thrives in cities, so does much else. It's in missing how much else that we made a terrible mistake, end quote. And suddenly the authors become Luddites. For some reason, the technology people use to work more comfortably from home needs to be sacrificed for the imagined innovations that will come only in an office. I don't know if this narrative is true. Either way, the authors are prepared to sacrifice comfort of remote workers for the possibility of more innovations. Quote, those much-mocked Bay Area parties where young engineers gather in group houses to ingest psychedelics and contemplate the singularity matter. End quote. I just wanted to add this here because I wasn't sure where else to put it. Now, no, it wasn't written ironically. They definitely mean that. We don't know how technology will change things until it's in use, and the writers of the book are very optimistic about AI, which could easily lead to new problems, yet they aren't worried about AI. They're worried about Zoom and remote work. Even though working from home has proven to be beneficial productively and it causes less pollution. So why then? Who is this for? Well, it's for older educated corporate neoliberals who still read books. I think this is an attempt at forming a bridge between old Ivy League Clinton-era Democrats and new Silicon Valley tech guys worth fortunes who still go to Burning Man. It's two generations of business people interacting to achieve the same ends, funnel taxpayer money into making cool new stuff for us instead of giving it to poor people. So why, you may ask, why knock Zoom? Because older business owners who rent office spaces and want their employees to work in the office are going to read this book. But do the writers actually believe we work better together in person? Is it true that we learn best from the people beside us? Ezra Klein on his podcast argues that AI can be used to custom educate kids, so obviously he doesn't really believe we need to learn from people that share in the same space. Quote, making progress in these industries requires first that we want to understand how does this industry actually work. From that question, we can emerge an agenda for overcoming the barriers to growth, end quote. I think abundance can make salient points, but I don't think it goes far enough in addressing why these barriers persist. It's like pointing at a weed, explaining how it grew and that it's bad for other plants, but we're ignoring the metaphorical roots that spurred the growth in the first place. It might be a struggle, but it's possible to uproot. However, more weeds will keep accumulating because we never addressed the prime environment the weed grew in the first place. In our capitalist environment, we have economic incentives under the surface that blossom into harmful outcomes. Without addressing the environment that grows legislation written by and benefiting the wealthy, we'll likely just see more of it, even if we do eliminate some successfully. I think the book is fine when explaining the barriers to housing and technology. They do identify legislation put in the way to prevent construction and money being spent, though Abundance neither delves into the capitalist environment where these problems originate, nor does it wish to do so. Innovations aren't inherently good or bad, and I'm not advocating we dismantle all bad technology and return to some imagined better state of life. In another world, textile workers could have profited off of the machines that replaced them. I think it's important to recognize the interests that spur innovations and who benefits from them and who is harmed by them. To do otherwise would be dishonest. There's something that bothers me about this book that's hard to put into words. After reading Jason Stanley's book, How Propaganda Works, he describes a crisis that a group can use to achieve an unpopular goal. By masking this unpopular goal as a solution to the crisis, something unreasonable can be disguised as reasonable. War for profit is obviously wrong, but if it's marketed as war for freedom, then it sounds reasonable. In A Handmaid's Tale, a new government creates a patriarchal class system where men rule over women. The idea isn't initially popular with the mainstream public, but a fertility crisis becomes the problem solved by subjugating women and making more babies. In the end, subjugating women doesn't result in making more babies, but That was never really the goal in the first place. The class system wasn't the solution, it was the goal all along. Thinking about Abundance's argument for Democrats to focus more on supply and supplied-side economics makes me think about the propaganda dynamic. The point of abundance is to make more and better things, which will theoretically solve our inequality crisis by producing more affordable things. Food and healthcare aren't the main focus of the book. The shortage of doctors is mentioned, and how the government caused the shortage. We could have an abundance of doctors, but even if a hospital is full of doctors and you're the only patient, the cost of care isn't going to go down. America has a commodified healthcare system, but it doesn't abide by supply and demand. America currently has lots of food and lots of food waste. When food doesn't sell, some grocery stores throw it away and lock their dumpsters to keep anyone from salvaging it. It seems like even if supply is high, it will be curbed artificially for profit. Abundance has a reasonable sounding solution to the inequality crisis, solved by repealing specific legislation and spending taxpayer money on corporate innovations, but is that the real solution, or Ezra and Derik's real goal? Repeal legislation and pump money into corporate America, but this time for a progressive cause. They're rejecting direct action in favor of a roundabout method of improving people's lives, prioritizing things over people, and I think that's what bothers me. They're capitalists. They want the government to invest in companies expecting innovation in return. Instead, the government could invest in people without expecting anything in return. That is a thing that the government can do when it isn't motivated by capital. It can focus on public good. It might not sound like I enjoyed this book all that much, though I actually did in a weird way. I'm not the first to make a lot of these observations about abundance, but I really wanted to get into the weeds and cite parts of the book for a fuller picture for those who haven't read it. Thanks again to my aunt for getting it. It really was a fun challenge to delve in and make this, so thanks so much for listening and watching.